reptiles and trees, which never stop growing. I don't know if you know that, but some reptiles, some amphibians, and trees never stop growing. The longer they live, the bigger they get. And they would just keep growing. They reach incredible sizes if they have these conditions. Also, there's tremendous healing in hyperbaric conditions, and we don't understand that. That was discovered by mistake. Some guys were cut when they were down under the water under high pressures, and they healed very rapidly. In fact, there are clinics here where they'll do surgery and some recovery under hyperbaric. They'll pump the pressures up. They don't change the percentage of oxygen. They just pump the pressures up, and you'll heal much better. So healing also takes better under these things. Before, let's take the waters that were divided into seas and land, the waters below. In the seas, the waters were gathered together in one place. And they were probably shallow. Subsurface features of our present oceans indicate that they were much shallower ocean levels. In other words, what we have is we have features down that are under the surface now that were exposed to the atmosphere at one time. We know from the oxides and the rocks and everything that those were exposed to the atmosphere. So our seas were probably in this this creation world. Right after the creation, the seas were a lot shallower than they are now. The seas were probably covered a much smaller portion of the Earth's surface also. And currently, there's 70% of the Earth's surface is oceans and seas. 1/2 of that is over a mile deep. And if you spread those over the whole Earth, if the Earth was flat and you spread it out there, you know what the average depth over the whole Earth would be with water? 1 mile. So the Earth before was probably a lot shallower, a lot smaller, and a lot flatter. The Earth was. Let's look at the land here. Land would have been, since the Lord will bring down the mountains in the future, He considers them being haughty, the mountains. The originally created good earth probably had no haughty mountains or hills and was relatively flat. That's also the indication of the fossils that we find from coal and others. It indicates that these were, it was almost an aquatic environment, but very low and everything. There's not much of what you would call mountain type of vegetation. The number of animal and plant life species was much more numerous than today. We know this from the fossil records, that there are probably 100 times more species than we have today. We're down, evolutionary biologists even indicate that we're down to 1% is all that's left of the species that have lived on the earth. We're down to 1%. 99% of all species have died or disappeared, become extinct. And we know that from the fossil record. The land was watered by a mist from subterranean water sources. Like we say, there was no rain, but it was watered by a mist that came up from the surface, from below the surface. And so there was no rain in those days. This is a strange world, isn't it? All the plants and animals were according to their kind in Genesis creation. There's no possibility of flora and fauna species mixing with other species. Now, do you know why that's very important? No species would survive if they were allowed to cross over with other species, because each species has very distinct characteristics that allow it to survive. You could take an extreme case. What if bacteria had an elephant's nose, you know? You lose any of your characteristics as humans, and you can't survive very well. If a shark, for instance, lost its sensory deals that it has up there, that's able to detect prey miles away, you and I can't do that. So God had set up these things very distinctly so that each one can survive. It has very special skill sets, very special anatomy, very special characteristics to survive. And if you cross those over even closer to another species, pretty soon they can't live. So He doesn't allow the species to mix their characteristics and kill themselves off. They would be unable to survive if God hadn't set up these ironclad barriers between species, because they foolish would if He hadn't done that. Genetically, we're locked into species. The other consequence of that is that these genetic walls of separation between species also makes an evolution of a new species impossible. You're locked in, and you can't jump. For instance, to jump to a new species, it means you can't breed back to the previous one. So if where you have sexual reproduction, you have to have a male and a female, and they have to occur at the same point in time for that species to survive. And they have to be of breeding age. That's statistically impossible. So there's two things that come about from this. One, it's a preservation of the species that are by keeping their characteristics without mixing them with other undesirable characteristics of other species. And it also, these walls of separation keep it so that you cannot have any evolutionary process. As we look at the things, almost all of the present species on the earth exist in fossils without change. If you find one here today, an animal living, you can find its fossil remains exactly in the same form, unchanged. In fact, there are no intermediate forms. Also, conversely, some of evolutionary's most ancient species are alive and unchanged today as what? Living fossils. Some of the very oldest forms of life, they say, in the evolutionary process, down at the Precambrian layer, exist today. They call them living fossils. They never changed. They were never left behind in the struggle for survival or natural selection. They weren't naturally selected out. All these lines of separation are kept all through history. Some of them have disappeared, but the ones that are also the ones that existed way back at the beginning. Other things about plants and animals. You see in the fossil record what? Giants of plants and animals. You have some of those dinosaurs that are 80 and 100 tons. There's not enough oxygen to keep those babies alive at that size. It's just like you would expect from the creation accounts. What happened to them? They ran out of oxygen. There's not enough partial oxygen percentages to survive in today's climate. But they exist in the fossils. You have a hyperbaric, in other words, a high-pressure atmosphere that would allow for those ancient animals to exist before the canopy disappeared. 99%, as we said, of the original created species are extinct today. The index fossils that's the major fossil species that you find in each layer. Now, I'm not saying these layers are laid down to have anything to do with ages, but they're laid down in this way. They're not in the right order in most cases, but the ones that you classify them by, those are called index fossils. And in these, the interesting thing is, they're found in the ones that are found in every geological layer except the Ice Age Pleistocene have uniform worldwide temperatures. Those index fossils are the same whether you find them at the equator, and Antarctic, Arctic, or on the top of Mount Everest. They're all the same temperature environment that they grew up in, that they survived in. In fact, I saw recent studies, this is 2 years ago, that the sediments coming off the bottom of the Arctic Ocean indicate the plant and animal life that the temperature at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean was 74 degrees day and night. I mean, what are they talking about? And you go down to Antarctica, and the fossil beds, probably the largest in the world down there, are made out of what? Tropical and semi-tropical plants that don't exist anymore, lycopods. Huge coal beds of tropical plants, ferns and everything, palm trees and everything, What are they doing in Antarctica? Trees don't even grow there. You don't have anything. But that's where you find tropical plants. You go to the Arctic region, Siberia. What are the coal beds made out of? One of my Russian friends, he's here tonight, I think. His sister worked as a nurse in one of those coal mines. This is in the old days of the Cold War. She was a nurse on an island up there, and they're mining coal, and it's made out of what? Tropical plants. What are they doing growing up there? Unless it's like what Genesis says it was. Uniform temperatures, no rain, and yet they're watered from below. But the index fossils indicate that. They also, the plants and animals of the creation before the Noahic flood lived in a tropical or semi-tropical temperature habitat. And this was found uniformly throughout the whole world, including Antarctica and the Arctic. Uniform temperatures in every layer except the very last one, the Pleistocene, which is the Ice Age. It's right at the top. In fact, out here where we live, we were under the Ice Age. This was the furthest reach of the glaciers during the Ice Age.